Hello?
Hey, Jim?
Yes.
Yes, Jason Saulnier here.
How you doing?
Very good. So Jim Valance here with me. And, what you've been up to lately? You've retired out of the songwriting business?
Well, sort of. I mean, I'm almost 60. I've been doing it since I was 16. It's the only job I've ever had. So, I felt like I was in need of a rest, or at least, try some other things. But I took almost 10 years off. Did very, very little writing for 10 years, and I've just started recently to do a bit of writing again with Bryan Adams. We wrote a song for German television for the Olympic broadcast in Germany. Something they're going to play in and around the game broadcast on their national television station. And I'm really happy with what we came up with. It was really fun to write. So I don't think I'll go back full time to songwriting, but every once in a while it's fun again.
So, Bryan Adams, you've been with him for forever, and you wrote the biggest hit songs for Bryan Adams. Is it great working back with him?
I have a real level of comfort with Bryan. I've known him for 30 years, I think. I met him in 1978, so he helped me with the math there. But I've known him for a really long time, and songwriting, especially collaborating with another writer, is really a personal thing. You have to have a level of trust and comfort, and I have that with Bryan. We've just done it so much. I think he and I have spent about 20,000 hours together.
Wow.
In a small room with our guitars. So, like I said, there's a lot of comfort there. So yeah, I always enjoy writing with Bryan.
With the big songs with Bryan Adams, like let's say Reckless album, which sold I don't know how many copies. How long did it take to actually write that album? Would you say?
Well,
a year?
I mean, that's an interesting. Yeah, it was a year. I mean, it sounds like, well, it took you a year to write 12 songs, but we didn't just write 12 songs. We wrote a lot of songs that you'd spend a whole week writing a song and get to the point where you go, it's not that great, and start again. So there's a lot of stuff that we abandoned, early in the process because we knew it wasn't going anywhere. There's other songs we wrote that we ended up giving to somebody else. So, it was a really busy, hard, productive year. And at the end of it, we felt we had 12 songs that belonged on that album. So, it took a year, but we wrote more than 12 songs.
Are you really happy with that product of Reckless? Was it just like you imagined it?
Well, yeah, I mean, you just never know. I mean, I think when we finished writing the songs and when we finished the album, there's, after all that work, a year of writing and recording, you kind of go, oh boy, I'm glad that's done.
Yeah.
And you hope you've done your best work, and then you don't really know until the album's released and you see the results of the sales and the chart numbers. But I think it sold 12 or 15 million copies, and we got a number one single and a number of top 10 singles. So yeah, it was very gratifying to have all that work pay off in such a significant way, but we couldn't have predicted it. We didn't know that it was going to do that well. We just did the best work that we could and hoped for the best.
How did you get to record, let's say, like the song Warmachine with Kiss, like in '82? Who introduced who?
That one, that was produced by a guy named Michael James Jackson, I think. Obviously not to be confused with Michael Jackson.
Michael Jackson, yeah.
He approached us. I think he's Canadian, if I'm not wrong. I think he's Canadian, so he was aware of Bryan and I as writers. And this is before Bryan had any real success, so we were still, struggling as songwriters. So we got a call, asking if we'd like to write a song for Kiss, and at that point in our career, it was a real privilege to be able to write for a band of that stature. So, so we said yes, and we took it on. And there was I think Warmachine was a song that Gene Simmons had already started. So we were working with something that was already underway, but it was far from finished. So, we had quite a bit of work to do on it. And we finished it, and we recorded a demo and sent it back, and Gene really liked it. So, that was, again, very gratifying to have that, start with a phone call and end up, again, with an album that sold, quite a few million copies.
And did you get to meet Gene Simmons and all that and write with him?
No, we did it long distance. So we spoke with him on the phone. We've never met him. But we had a couple of conversations on the phone that were interesting. Everyone kind of knows what Gene is like from the reality TV show. Everyone gets a pretty good sense of what he's like, and he's he was like that on the phone. He was very confident and very certain and sure about what he wanted. But he gave us some rope. We did what we thought was right, and he liked what we did. So it was a successful collaboration.
And at that time, like in, let's say, 1982, when this would have been done, like the album leaking out and stuff like that, the cassettes would be trading off through the mail?
That was pretty rare back then. You really can't compare that to what we have today. If something leaks today, it's around the world in a couple of hours. Back then, there really weren't any leaks. It was rare, and even in terms of unauthorized copies, someone might buy an album and make a cassette for their friend, but if you're aware of cassette technology, a cassette sounds pretty crappy, and then once you make a copy, in other words, a cassette of a cassette, it starts to sound really, really awful. So you can't go more than about one copy without cassette starting to sound so bad you wouldn't even want to own it. Whereas, nowadays with MP3s, you can make a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy infinitely, and the original and the 100th copy sound exactly alike. So it wasn't really a dilemma back then. Albums would sell if you did a good album, if you did good work and had some good songs. It was not uncommon to sell 10 million copies of an album, and I would guess that maybe out of that 10 million, you might have had 50,000 unauthorized copies on cassette.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas nowadays, you're lucky to sell 100,000 albums, and the MP3 unauthorized copies are going to number in the tens of millions. So it's actually exactly the opposite. Millions and millions of unauthorized copies and only 100,000 or a few 100,000 legitimate sales. So it's really hard to compare then and now.
But Gene would have sent you like a cassette tape of the demo to work with at that time?
Oh, I see what you mean. So you're not even talking about fan leaks. You're talking about how we actually...
Like, I understand about the fan leaks because, yes, that's how it is bad today. But let's say in those days, like a big stature band like Kiss, they were not afraid of leaking, like if they did not know you good enough to send you?
There's sort of a code,
Okay.
Amongst professional musicians. You just, that's not something you would do. So, no, that was never a concern. And again, talking about technology, because this recent song I wrote with Bryan, I was in Canada and Bryan was in England. We weren't even in the same room when we wrote it. We would send ideas back and forth by email. We sent audio files back and forth. Sometimes we use Skype or iChat to, convey ideas back and forth. But back in 1982 with Gene Simmons, I can't remember if he put it in the mail or if he used FedEx, but he sent a cassette tape from Los Angeles to Vancouver, and we listened to his cassette tape. And then we wrote our song and recorded a cassette and put it in the mail or FedEx and sent it down to Gene, and 2 or 3 days later, he had a listen. Whereas nowadays, it's instant. If you are collaborating long distance with another writer, with email and MP3s, you can go back and forth instantaneously. And again, with quality that's the original and the copy are identical. So very, very different circumstances from then till now.
That's a good point. Thank you for going to that. Rock and Roll Hell, where would Gene Simmons have heard a Bachman-Turner Overdrive song that you wrote in that time?
Yeah, I don't remember quite how he came to know of that one. Yeah, because it did start off as a Bachman-Turner Overdrive song that I wrote for BTO, and somehow Gene became aware of it, and we ended up writing another verse. Gene jumped in and extended the song. So the one that I wrote for BTO, I believe, only had 2 verses, and then Gene added a 3rd verse. And Bryan added a bridge section. So the 2 songs are similar, but the Kiss version has a little bit more material in it than the original BTO version.
And Gene Simmons souped that up very well on the album. Very powerful song.
I like how it sounded. Michael did a really good job of producing that album. It has a really big sound. I don't know where they recorded it. I think it was the Record Plant in Los Angeles, a big studio down there. But I was really pleased with the sound of that album. And
you also worked with Ozzy Osbourne in the Osmosis years, and I seen on your JimValance.com website you have a little demo of you working on that song.
Yeah, I mean, Ozzy was great, and people who, again, I mentioned people watch the Gene Simmons television show and they form an opinion on what kind of person Gene is. And I guess you could watch the Ozzy Osbourne show, the Osbourne reality show on television, and come away with the idea that Ozzy's a little bit slow and, but the fact is he's a very, very intelligent man and very lovely and very funny, and I really enjoyed working with Ozzy a lot. And again, I was very pleased with what we came up with. He's a great guy to collaborate with. Really, really good ideas.
And with Ozzy, did you collaborate one-on-one in person?
Yes, Ozzy came to Vancouver, and we spent I think on 2 occasions, we spent about a week together, just Ozzy and I in a room, and we wrote more than 2 songs. We wrote 3 or 4 songs, and only 2 of them I think were ever released. And there's a couple of other ones that are still just on the shelf that I hope will one day come out.
That'd be very nice to see.
I'd be happy. Yeah.
Me too. I'd be super happy to hear that stuff. That'd be. Do you think he's got a back catalog that's never been issued?
Everybody does.
Yeah.
Every artist, every album that's recorded, in my experience anyway, you have maybe 10 or 12 songs on an album, but usually the band writes about 20 songs, maybe records 15, and releases 12. So you have at least 3 songs that are recorded, and you have another maybe 5 songs that were written but not finished. So every artist has a backlog of material. And sometimes, like with Aerosmith, there's one song I wrote with them in the early 1990s called Sedona Sunrise that they didn't release back then, but they waited until, I think it was almost 2000 or 2002 until they released that. So sometimes artists do go back, and actually they waited until 2006, and we wrote it in 1989. And some artists do go back and look at the unreleased material, and after 10 or 15 years they go, not such a bad song, let's put it on the next album. So if you're lucky and you're patient, you can wait, and sometimes the songs that were rejected eventually find a release.
Throughout your whole career, how many albums would you have participated in? Do you have a rough idea?
I would have to guess maybe 100 albums, maybe, and 300 songs, something like that. But that's released. So like I told you, everything doesn't get finished and everything doesn't get released. So maybe I wrote 1,000 songs and 300 were released. That's my guess.
And you're coming from the band Prism. Also, you worked with them and you played.
That was my first small success. Was with Prism. I was the drummer in that band and also the main songwriter. That's way back. That's 1977.
Would you ever play again with a group like that?
I don't know. I mean, I was a drummer with that band, but as a songwriter, I played keyboards and guitar. But I really enjoy drumming. I mean, if you've ever played a drum kit, it's even if you're not very good at it, it's a lot of fun. And I still, there's part of me that still, is a drummer. So every once in a while I play. I played on a few Bryan Adams things. I played on, I think I played on one thing by the Scorpions, 38 Special, a couple of Aerosmith things. So every once in a while, I get invited to play, drums with one of the bands. But I wouldn't want to have to be a member of the band and tour and, commit fully. But every once in a while, it's fun to be a drummer.
So you've been basically all-round musician all your life.
I started off as a musician. Before I was a songwriter, I was a musician, and then I played in bands, I played in clubs, I did quite a bit of session work, playing on commercials for McDonald's restaurant and Canadian Airlines and all kinds of things, Toyota cars. And then after that became a full-time songwriter. But even as a songwriter, you still have to be a musician. And sometimes when I work with a band in writing a song, they would say, why don't you come and play something on the album? Aerosmith asked me to play organ on a song called Rag Doll, and with Ozzy I did some playing, and like I mentioned, the Scorpions and so on. So yeah, it's fun to participate as a musician too.
What did you play on the Ozzy Osbourne album?
Well, I mean, it depends. There were a couple of different releases. The couple of songs that Ozzy wrote, one of them was called Walk on Water, and that was produced by, was it Moby that did that? I think Moby produced it, and Ozzy wasn't that happy with the result, so he decided afterwards to release the demo version as well.
Mm-hmm.
So on that one, I played guitar, bass, and drums, and Ozzy did all the vocals. So there's two versions of that, one that was produced by Moby and one that was produced by me and Ozzy, and they were both released at some point.
That's a good honor to have been, on a recording with Ozzy Osbourne.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm not just a musician and a songwriter, I'm also a fan. So I'm a big fan of Ozzy, and to work with him was a real thrill.
Did you happen to see that Ozzy's got a new book out, I Am Ozzy?
Is it released yet?
Yes, it's released in Canada, I think, Monday.
Oh, okay. No, I haven't seen it yet, but I'll look for that.
Yeah, a really good book. I just got it yesterday.
Oh, good. I mean, Ozzy has great stories. He's working with him, you have to tell him to stop talking sometimes, because he loves telling stories, and his stories are so funny that you're just laughing until you almost fall off your chair. So, there's nobody I enjoy spending time with more than Ozzy. He's just the funniest man.
Who is one of the best musicians that you've worked with in your whole career? I'm sure the list is huge.
The list is long. I mean, I've had some incredible experiences. If I think about guitar players, I worked with Steve Stevens from
Billy Idol
band. That's when he was with Michael Monroe from Hanoi Rocks.
Okay.
I worked with Joe Perry, of course, from Aerosmith, and he's an amazing guitar player. A guy named Dan Huff, who was with a band called Giant. He did a lot of work with, everybody. He worked with everybody from Michael Jackson to Shania Twain as a studio musician. Keyboard players. David Foster. Is an amazing keyboard player. Drummers. Herman Rebel from the Scorpions. I really enjoy his playing. I've had it's been a privilege to be in the same room with these people and just watch them do their thing. These are really talented people. They're extraordinary.
Sometimes when you go to songwriting and you can't come up with ideas, what happens then?
You know what? You go for a walk, or you go for a lunch or a dinner. You just take a break. Sometimes you sit for hours and hours, and you try and try and try, and nothing happens. There's just no inspiration and no ideas, and that's always the best time to go for a walk or take a lunch break or a dinner break. And then when you come back, you have a new perspective and a bit more energy. And Bryan and I used to discuss that some of our best songs were written after dinner. We would spend all day and have nothing, and then we go out and have dinner and come back, and suddenly inspiration would arrive. So believe me, I'm accustomed to long periods of no inspiration at all, and then you get these little bursts where suddenly everything just happens.
Another idea. Do you write the music first? Sometimes you approach the lyrics first. 90% time, where do you go?
I've been asked this question a lot of times, and in my experience, I mean, speaking personally, I've always found it much easier to write the music first and then try to find the lyrics. And most people that I've worked with and most writers that I've talked to prefer to work that way. And the exceptions are Elton John, who likes to work with the lyric first.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, Bernie Taupin writes the lyric and gives it to Elton, and then Elton writes the music to the lyric. But 90% of songwriters that I've talked to prefer to write the music first and then find the lyric.
Is it mostly acoustic guitar, piano?
It really depends. I mean, that's another good question, because when things are just not happening, sometimes it's a good idea to change the instrument. So if you're writing on guitar and the ideas just aren't coming, sometimes I'll switch to piano, and it gives you a different way of looking at even at the same chords. You tend to play a different set of chords on piano than you would on guitar, so it can open up some ideas that might not have occurred on the other instrument. And sometimes I'll play acoustic guitar, sometimes I'll play electric guitar, so I really tend to move around a bit with the instruments to try to keep it fresh and interesting.
Has there been any songs bass-driven, with the bass, done with the bass verse?
You know what, that's another good question, because when I wrote with Bryan Adams, a lot of times Bryan would play guitar and I would play bass. And the thing that I used to like about playing bass, and musicians will understand this, Bryan could be playing a C chord and not change it, just keep playing a C chord. But when I'm playing bass, I could change from a C to an F,
mm-hmm.
and I'm the one that's driving the chord change. Suddenly you have an interesting chord, which is an F on the bass and a C on the guitar. It's an unusual but very interesting chord. And then I can even take the bass and move it to an A, and Bryan is still playing a C, and I have what's called an A minor 7. So from a songwriting point of view, the bass can really drive the chord progression. So yeah, many times I've enjoyed being the bass player during a writing session. And the song Ragdoll by Aerosmith is another example of that. I played bass while Joe was playing guitar, and he just played this riff, and I made the bass move around and had the opportunity to sort of, dictate the chord progression. I mean, none of that would have happened without Joe's amazing riff anyway, but yeah, bass is a powerful and underestimated songwriting instrument.
What do you think the future of songwriting is going to end up like, with guitar riffs starting to be duplicated from the past, let's say in another 50 years from now?
I think there's always going to be good songwriters. I think there's always going to be good songs. I think there's always going to be bad songs. But, each generation seems to come up with something really amazing. And, whether it's Frank Sinatra in the 40s, Elvis in the 50s, the Beatles in the 60s, lots of great music in the 70s, everything from the Eagles to the Sex Pistols, and the 80s, the Police, and
mm-hmm.
and U2, and there's always been somebody, some writer, some group, some band that has really defined the era and written amazing music. And I think we'll see that forever. I think there will always be really brilliant musicians, really brilliant songwriters that bring something really good to the table.
One final question. What do you think of someone like Robert Johnson in the 1930s, picking up his guitar and doing his music?
I'm of two minds on that. I mean, I'm not really a musical historian, and I have some affinity for the blues, but not a deep understanding. So I have to I have to arrive at Robert Johnson through other people. I have to read Eric Clapton's book. I have to read interviews with Keith Richards and Jimmy Page to understand the influence that Robert Johnson had on them, and then I understand. But when I listen to Robert Johnson, I hear such rough, raw music that it's almost difficult for me to piece it together. You know, it's like seeing the ruin of a building or a human skeleton and trying to imagine the full body or the full building. So, you know, I understand it. I appreciate it. I'm just not quite there. But obviously he had a huge influence on some of my heroes, like Jimmy Page and Eric Clapton and the others. So I have to make an attempt to understand it.
Pleasure talking to you, and your sources of information are awesome, and look forward to seeing your future releases.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for taking the time.
Well, Jim, you have a good evening, and keep in touch.
Okay, I promise. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.